Joining us now on Morning Joe, Columbia University professor Dr. Jeffrey Sachs and president and founder of Eurasia Group and foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large for Time magazine, Ian Bremmer. The Eurasia Group is out with its annual forecast of the political risks most likely to play out over the course of the year. Guys, good morning. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
So, Ian, you brought us a cheery New Year's countdown list of the biggest risks around the world.
Absolutely.
Let's start right at the top with number one. You call it bad seeds. These are geopolitical dangers. What are we talking about specifically here?
We're talking about pretty much every major indicator that Eurasia Group follows around the world geopolitically are trending presently in a negative direction. That's true whether you look at all the major relationships around the world, U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China, transatlantic, intra-Europe, intra-Middle East, not to mention the erosion of political institutions in the U.S. and most of our major allies. That's pretty unusual, right? And that doesn't necessarily say crisis in 2019. A lot of this stuff isn't urgent, but our ability to respond to the next crisis. You think about the 2008 financial crisis, right? The United States, Dems, Republicans in Congress got together. Bush and Obama both kind of fighting the same fight to try to get us out of there. And also, we had the support of the Europeans, even the Chinese, right? To try to, let's avoid depression. After 9/11, America came together after Bush, right? And our allies, and even the Russians, supported us. Whatever the next crisis is, a pandemic or cyber or terrorism or more likely the next major economic downturn, the geopolitics are lined up precipitously badly to allow us to respond effectively, both inside as a country and broadly as a world. And that's what bad seeds is all about.
So how much of that, Ian, is tied to number 5 on your list, which is the U.S. at home, chaos at home, political tumult at home, the President of the United States veering from one policy to the next, creating lies, making things up? How much of 1 and 5 are linked?
A little, perhaps less than you'd think, in the sense that, first of all, in 21 years since we started this firm, this is the first time that the U.S. domestically has ever appeared on this list. So clearly it matters. And yet the U.S. is by far the most powerful country in the world, and it's only number 5, right? And so why is that? I think this is the year, as the investigations come down and they go after not only Trump personally, his family, his organization, his business interests, we know he's going to lash out in response to that. And the question is, if he tries to engage in using the powers of the presidency in an extra-legal way, do the institutions of the country constrain him? They're going to be sorely tested. I would argue that they will, that ultimately the Supreme Court, if they need to rule on the president did something that is against the Constitution, they'll rule as an independent judiciary. But I wish we could feel more confident about that. And clearly, the fact that that's even a question in 2019, and the way that, by the way, it wasn't in 2018, is something that we have to be worried about as we head into this year.
And we also, by the way, may get the results of Robert Mueller's investigation this year, which could put this all into a new light.
Absolutely.
Dr. Sachs, as you look around the world as we head into a new year, where are your areas of greatest concern?
Well, I agree with everything Ian said, but I would emphasize that it does come down to the fact that we have a presidential system with an absolutely unfit and impulsive president. We don't have policy right now. We are lurching day to day. Trump is unstable psychologically. The pressures are rising, and he's likely to become even more unstable. And what we call policy is not policy. It's made up by the hour, where we have troops, where we have huge dangers of conflict in Syria. It's obviously being made up day by day. You think Trump and the wall, which is weird. He probably believes what he's saying because he's got these paranoid ideations that are all over the place, and he thinks probably that there's this massive terrorist assault coming from the southern border. I believe he believes this. We have a presidential system which unwisely gave a tremendous amount of power to the president, especially in foreign policy, over the last 50 years. And now we're living the dangers of this. And I think most people, not in his narrow base, understand that this man is psychologically unstable. But politically, it's frozen right now, and it's very, very dangerous.
Well, I certainly agree with you guys, and another way maybe to think about it is we've become kind of neo-isolationists. We've pulled back from our role in the world, and you can think almost metaphorically, if he had moved those 2,000 troops from Syria, they were in effect going to the southern border and all of that kind of talk. But let me turn to China, Ian, because obviously that's a fraught relationship. It's one that has huge economic consequences. You can see what's going on in China with their economy slowing, which is not really great for us either. There's now more trade talks going on. Are you hopeful or are you pessimistic that we can put the China egg back together?
I'm hopeful that we will not have a move towards 25% tariffs in March. In other words, that we won't be talking about an escalation of the trade war. President Trump has been very careful not to go after Xi Jinping personally at any point, almost like the way he approaches President Putin in Russia. And I think he's made it very clear, even in the last 24 hours, that he wants to show progress. Show that he's the kind of president that can, with this big tough guy, Xi Jinping, can come to a deal. Kind of like what he's done with Kim Jong-un, even though there's not much substance to any quote-unquote agreement. Now, that means that we don't have a trade war, but it doesn't mean that you're not going to have big problems with the Chinese structurally in a whole bunch of other areas. You'll compartmentalize that one issue the markets care about, but on technology, for example, on the South China Sea, for example, on Taiwan, for example, I think we're heading for an awful lot of bigger challenges between the Americans and the Chinese, and no one's going to come out of March thinking that we've resolved the relationship between the two most important economies in the world.
I think it's really important to distinguish between neo-isolationism and unilateralism, and what we have is unilateralism. Trump breaks rules, breaks treaties, takes the U.S. out of international agreements willy-nilly, but he's not isolationist per se. He's putting sanctions on here, threatening war here, destabilizing an economic relationship with China, and I believe, again, a paranoid way. Today, there's a story about the fears that China-made metro cars could spy on us. Everything is paranoid right now, absolutely weird, and I think that the danger is an psychologically unstable president who acts completely unilaterally to the extent that his staff has no idea what he's going to do from one day to the next. He reaches an agreement and then no agreement. It's repudiated an hour later.
So, Ian, as I look down your list, two countries I don't see, Saudi Arabia and Iran. You say they're red herrings in 2019. Secretary Pompeo is overseas this week, expected to give an address where he praises Saudi Arabia. We've seen drafts of that address. Saudi Arabia for its handling of the Khashoggi murder, if you can believe that. The president, of course, gave the Crown Prince a pass on that, as did this administration. Why do you call them red herrings?
Red herrings because they're risks people talk about that won't play out in 2019. It's important to recognize that. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the reason we now have a ceasefire in Yemen in the port of Hodeidah is because Mohammed bin Salman, who has been constrained both internationally and to a degree domestically in that country, decided that he was going to end what had been a very brutal proselytization of what is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. That's significant, probably means that the blockade against Qatar will be reduced, if not removed, over the course of the year. Meanwhile, MBS in Saudi Arabia is going nowhere, right? So it's not playing out in 2019. In the case of Iran, Secretary of State Pompeo will admit privately that if Trump doesn't get a second term, nothing's going to happen on Iran, that Trump will have failed. In other words, a Democratic president comes in, they go back to the deal. Meanwhile, the Iranians can run out the clock and continuing to behave in accordance with the existing Iran deal that the Americans, as Jeff Sachs said, pulled out of unilaterally, but everyone else is engaging with. So in 2019,